From the boardroom to the shop floor, good business runs on good governance. Join esteemed expert in governance, Dr. Nimrod Mbele, for the next hour as he takes us beyond governance, making sense of doing business in South Africa.
A very good evening and welcome to tonight's installment of Beyond Governance here at 101.9 High FM. My name is Nimrod Mbele. On this show, we examine the leadership decisions, governance choices, and institutional realities that shapes the future of the country. In tonight's show, we turn attention to institutions that affect millions of South Africans, and yet often are understood only when people change their jobs or retire. In the main, we're talking about retirement fund industry. Globally, retirement funds manage more than 60 trillion in long-term savings, making them among the world's largest institutional investors. As you know, they finance infrastructure, support capital markets, influence corporate governance, and provide long-term financial security for millions of people. In South Africa, we know that South Africa in the continent has one of the most sophisticated retirement fund industries among the emerging economies. Our retirement funds manage more than 7 trillion in assets, equivalent to about 75% of the country's GDP. On behalf of this investment is made on behalf of about 15 million beneficiaries. And yet it is a paradox. What is the paradox in the South African context? Despite having one of the most developed retirement systems, research suggests that fewer than 1 in 10 South Africans retire with sufficient income to maintain their standard of living. Many workers cash out in their retirement savings when changing jobs. Household financial pressures continues to grow, and millions remain outside the formal retirement system altogether. At the same time, the industry is experiencing its most significant transformation in decades. We might recall the two-part retirement system, artificial intelligence is coming in, a digital platform, cybersecurity. These are some of the rising governance expectations that are meant to change, if they're not changing, the retirement funds. We have picked up, we'll get more from my guest, that, this year marks the 70th year since the Pension Funds Act of 1956, which was a legislation that laid foundation for South Africa's modern retirement industry. So in tonight's conversation, there's a few questions that we want to pose to my guests. One of them is, how healthy is South Africa's retirement system compared with other emerging economies? Have a governance regulation kept pace with the changing risk of retirement? And how is technology reshaping way retirement fund operates and engage with members? In making sense of this very important and very complex question, I'm joined by Nazlie Seegers, who is the Chief Experience Officer at SALT Employees. Before we get to the gist of our conversation, I think it's important to first and foremost acknowledge, the producer and thank the producers to organize this wonderful show. We also want to thank Craig Guthrie, who's on a controller. And of course, most importantly, we urge you, the listener, to have questions that you want to pose via our WhatsApp line, which is 061-895-1019. And of course, your views, questions, thoughts, or reflections are always come via my accent, which underscored Dr. Mbele. Now that we dispense with the most basic things, let me take this opportunity to once again welcome my guest, Nazlie Seegers. Nazlie, good evening and welcome to Beyond Governance.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for having us this evening. We're honored to be here.
Thank you. The pleasure's mine. Who is Nazlie Seegers in a nutshell?
Nazlie Seegers is the Chief Experience Officer for SALT Employee Benefits. I'd like to think that I am one of the voices in the retirement fund industry that champion the cause of the member.
Thank you so much for that broad overview, because it's always important to get intimate with our listener. Nazlie, this year marks the 70 years since the Pension Funds Act of 1956. Why is this anniversary significant for South Africa retirement industry?
Thank you, sir. So I think it marks both the 70th anniversary of the Pension Funds Act and incidentally also the 70th anniversary for SALT Employee Benefits. So we share a birthday coincidentally. And, it's significant because it's such a major milestone. If you look back in the history of South Africa, we have a very colorful past. And if you recall, in the 1990s, etc., in the 1970s, workers stood up. They weren't automatically included in retirement savings, but they stood up and they fought for their right to participate in retirement saving schemes, to participate in these benefit saving schemes. Eventually, in 1956, the Pension Fund Act was born. And so you saw labor struggle through all of the different phases of our young democracy. And eventually all workers, had equal rights to retirement fund benefits. Now, the Pension Funds Act remains the foundation of our industry, but we've seen a lot of change and a lot of movement and tons of alignment with the rest of the world, so globally, in terms of changing from what used to be just a tick box exercise and sort of you participate if you can, to what are we actually achieving for the member at the end of the day? I think we've sort of had a full circle moment as an industry to say, are we really doing what we should be doing? You mentioned in the beginning of the discussion the numbers that we're seeing, and only 1 in 10 South Africans that participate in the sector. Remember that we don't have all our people participating in retirement funds. So we see only 1 in 10 of that small percentage that participates retire adequately. And what that does is it places burdens on future generations. So as an industry, we're looking back and saying, we've come this far, it's 70 years, but what does the next 70 years require of us?
Thank you so much for that insight, which really it's quite scary when you think about those numbers, but we'll get to those numbers and how society as a whole is moving towards closing the gap, and particularly in the context of high unemployment. But so far, I think, thank you for giving us a sense of what it means for the Pension Funds Act and how it has evolved. Perhaps maybe as a follow-up question, is that, South Africa is often regarded as having one of the most sophisticated retirement funds among emerging economies. Mm-hmm. How does our retirement system compare internationally? And in your view, what distinguishes it from our peers in the continent and globally?
So SALT was honored enough to attend a conference in Mauritius earlier this year that was attended by a lot of countries on the continent, as well as to engage after the Batsita conference in June with a delegation from Uganda and Kenya. And comparably, we're actually doing quite well in the retirement fund sector, where I wouldn't say ahead by leaps and bounds, but we're significantly ahead of our peers on the continent. So there's lots of lessons to be learned out of South Africa. And in turn, South Africa learns lots of lessons from, I think, in particular, Europe and Britain. We tend to model ourselves or sort of align ourselves with what they're doing on that side. So from a maturity point of view, I think we're doing quite well. In particular, in recent years, we've seen our regulator at the Financial Sector Conduct Authority regulate or introduce regulation that aims to achieve the outcomes that we should all be working towards. So we've gone from just this, compliance tick box. We've got these policies and they're sort of in place, and we've moved now to a place where we're asking, but is the policy working? Is the member reaping the benefit from, what it should be? What we need now is to align with that regulation, to enforce that regulation. I'm sure it's common knowledge that the FSCA publishes a listing of non-compliant employers at least once a quarter. And that listing has grown in the past couple of months. So they've started it in the last couple of years, but that listing is growing. It's not reducing. And so regulation alone is not enough. We've got to come together, not only as an industry, but as a country, and hold people accountable. And when I say as a country, the retirement fund industry has its set of laws and its set of prescripts that it follows in order to enforce. But you need government to come on board and say, for example, SALT works largely in the private security sector. We administer the private security sector provident fund. And In that sector, what you see is a lot of businesses that are non-compliant are not that. Absolutely, you do have those that are non-compliant simply because they, are mismanaging funds. But in many instances, you see businesses who are actually contracted to government. And in those instances, government is not settling their invoices in time, sometimes for 6 months at a time. Now, you think if you were a business, how are you going to roll cash flow for 6 months and pay your salaries and pay Provident Fund contributions? Something's got to give. So in those instances, it's not blatant non-compliance by the business. It's, as a result of the system that they find themselves in. And so to put this only on the retirement fund sector isn't correct. We've got to look at it as a society, and we've got to bring government closer, the regulator closer, industry closer, and society at large. Private businesses should be querying whether or not their service providers are paying across the retirement funds for their members. So there's a lot more work to be done from a social aspect, I think, but from a regulatory aspect, I definitely think that we're on the right track.
Thank you so much for those very interesting insights that you've shared with us. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want us to zoom a little bit more on the small enforcement side of the legislation, because to your point, enforcement is one of the biggest gaps. So perhaps maybe after the break, you'll give us a sense of, who are these culprits, and you've mentioned the need for accountability. So once after the break, we'll deal a little bit more on those issues.
This is Beyond Governance with Dr. Nimrod Dembele on 101.9 High FM.
Welcome back. If you've just joined us, my name is Nimrod. This is Beyond Governance here at 101.9 High FM. I'm joined by Nazlie Seegers, who's Chief Experience Officer at Salt Employee Benefits. In tonight's conversation, we're unpacking South Africa's retirement industry. Before we took that break, Nazlie gave us a very good insights on what are some of the glitches that is happening in the retirement industry. One of the issues that she raised, which I want to follow up, has got to do with, first and foremost, she noted that South Africa is ahead in an African continent, but there's obviously good indication that countries such as Uganda and Kenya are somehow finding their way, and South Africa, when it's measured against Europe, that's where we benchmark ourselves, which is quite good. And the issue that she raised is that, in the past, we have had regulations which were purely tick box approaches, and there's been some instances from government to try and introduce new sets of regulations such that we move away from tick box approach. But personally, for the benefit of the listener, and take out in confidence in terms of some of those regulations, and in the main, why government is not really, because we have seen issues of non-compliance from government itself. We've seen non-compliance from municipalities. Mm-hmm. Wherein, pension funds have been deducted, but they're not paid to, pension funds, institutions such that they're able to. What seems to be an issue, because, to your point around non-payment of invoices, since you operate in the private security sector, how big is this problem of non-compliance, and what are the root causes, and how do we get to a point around holding individual and institutions accountable?
Thank you, sir. So accountability, I think there is recourse in law. So there are steps that you can take in terms of the Pension Funds Act. And I think the regulator's been looking at it more. So I think one of the first steps they've taken is more transparency, more openness about where the non-compliance exists. And if you look at the listings, then municipal funds sit at the top of the listing together with the private security sector. There are other sectors sprinkled in there, but those two, have the biggest tally in terms of non-compliant employers. It's a structural problem. People are rolling cash flow because they're waiting for invoices. We talk about government awarding tenders or rotating tenders between security companies as an example, and then they don't pay invoices for a period of 6 to 9 months. Now, any business would struggle with cash flow in those instances. And so what the business owner will say to you is, I need to pay salaries at the end of the month. My guards need their salaries at the end of the month. So they prioritize today. And retirement seems to be, a concept that is future, and so we'll deal with it later on. Somehow we'll regularize it. And to be fair to some of these employers, they do. You see when their invoices start getting paid, because immediately you will see them come into some sort of arrangement with the Provident Fund. They will approach and ask, can they, get into a payment arrangement, etc. I'm not saying that that's the case for all. There are unscrupulous employers who are just stealing from, their members. And so, we've got to weed out the good ones from the bad ones. And then we've got to design solutions for the good ones. So those that are really struggling, we've got to hold government to account and say to them, if you don't pay invoices, you're impacting on the retirement opportunity for citizens of the country. Because before they are members of our retirement funds, they are citizens of South Africa to whom the government owes a duty of good faith. So there's a structural problem. Now, you do get those that just that flout the law and don't do what they're supposed to do, and it's got nothing to do with the government or their invoices. And in those cases, we've got to upskill our police force and our NPA. We've got to see better prosecution. In the last couple of months or during the last year, we did see a municipal manager and the CFO get arrested. So they filed criminal charges and they held them personally liable, for not paying across Provident Fund contributions or pension fund contributions. And very recently, one of the funds that we administer, the Transport Sector Retirement Fund, they overturned a determination by the OPFA. A company had gone into liquidation because, it's easy for these guys. They file for liquidation and then they think, okay, well, all the debt that they accumulated goes away. And then tomorrow they open a new company up and they start a whole cycle all over again. And in that instance, the fund, the OPFA ruled, the company is liquidated, we can't hold them liable. And the fund took it on appeal. They took it to the Financial Services Tribunal and they won the appeal. And the Financial Services Tribunal said, this determination needs to be reviewed. And on review, the adjudicator said those directors must be held personally liable. To say that the company is being liquidated is not good enough. And so they're holding those directors personally liable, which is a victory for our industry, because it now says you can't hide behind your entity. You as the responsible person for that entity, we will hold you to account.
I certainly agree with you that those kinds of measures, which have been long, expected, not only from, Provident Fund institutions, but mainly from the members, because ultimately you are sort of, denying, the return on investment, because if you're not investing or putting the required funds, the interest rates that you would have accrued on X becomes, it's not longer what you're going to get at the end of the day. So I think these are very good news, and we probably have to see more and more of those kind of arrests, more and more on officials who are not prioritizing pension funds for nefarious reasons. Obviously there are these nuggets. How big is the instances where municipality managers are being held to account and personally held liable for not complying with the law?
So I think that there are billions outstanding in terms of non-compliant employers. I don't know what the actual amount is in terms of municipal funds alone, but in terms of the private security sector, plus all of the other funds that they're managing, that they're mentioning in the FSCA quarterly report, we're talking about tens or hundreds of billions of rands that are outstanding to members. And I want to say, those are instances where the number is reported. Remember, there are places where funds are not reporting to the FSCA, or in instances where you've got, let's say you have an employer that's contributing and he's only declared 100 members to the fund, but actually he employs 1,000 members. So whatever the number is, my guess is that it's much larger than we actually understand the problem to be, because there is this issue of under-declaring membership. And so we don't even know what we don't know in terms of, figures that should be in there.
Sure, that's definitely a bigger problem in as far as declaring or non-declaring. Well, clearly, there's a lot of shenanigans, and I suppose not every member or the sector as a whole is riddled, but obviously there's some bad apples that needs to be uprooted so that we bring a bit of credibility into the system.
Absolutely. And I think, the way to do it is for industry, for the FSCA to partner with the South African Revenue Service, to partner with the UIF, to partner with SDL, so that we, triangulate the data and we see, okay, how many are they declaring to you versus how many are they declaring to me versus the next guy. And when we do that, we can then do a reconciliation and see where is the leakage in the system, who's under declaring to which party, and that's how we'll start to regularize these things.
I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to have another break on this very, very important point. And when we come back, I also want to urge our listeners to make their contributions, their observation, because the issues that you're putting to us are so important.
This is Beyond Governance with Dr. Nimrod Mbele on 101.9 High FM.
Welcome back. This is Beyond Governance. My name is Nimrod Mbele. I'm joined here by the one and only Nazlie Seegers, who's the Chief Experience Officer at Salt Employee Benefits. Tonight's conversation, we're getting a very good sense of the kind of issues and challenges that are bedeviling the retirement industry. One of the issues that, Nazlie raised just before we took that short break was a triangulation of data across key players. FSA needs to partner with the fund, and SARS, and government so that companies that are not declaring the correct statistics, the data that is being furnished can be triangulated so that you're able to close the gap. But this is something obviously that your sector is taking forward. When you think, if the screws can be tightened, this war can be won. Do you have any part of your strategy as an industry moving forward?
So I think the regulator has started by publishing the non-compliant employers. They're already bringing awareness to the market and to society at large to say, this is the issue. What needs to happen is we've got to hold everybody to account. We need to understand that this is a value chain. It's not just the retirement fund sector that's affected. When you have people that don't retire with adequate retirement savings, you place a burden on the fiscus, because what that means is that at retirement age, they're going to come to the state and say, I can't survive, you've got to help me. And so that cycle will continue until we get to a point where we've eventually achieved auto-enrollment. And auto-enrollment, I think for most people seems like a pipe dream at this point in time. But for Salt EB, as an administrator in this industry, we have focused on sector funds, meaning that we look at the marginalized worker. That's our space and that's where we play. And we feel like if we spent time correcting the system, if we made sure that we could regularize institutions like the private security sector, like municipal funds, if we can get those right, we use those as case studies, as proof of concepts. And then, once we've sorted that out, which is what we're trying to do together with the regulator and the bargaining councils and the role players in the industries, so that we can then say, okay, now we can make a case for auto-enrollment. And auto-enrollment is not something that only we're looking at as South Africa. It's something that the continent is looking at. And that brings me to a very different point. We've got to look at cross-border engagement on the continent. We looked at Regulation 28 and we said, okay, you can only put X amount of your assets overseas. Why would we be sending money to America and to Europe when there's a need for infrastructure on the continent? So not only in South Africa do we need better collaboration, across the continent we need better collaboration. We're sitting with trillions in unclaimed benefits. I would put money down that a lot of that money belongs to migrant labor. And they've gone home to their countries and their families don't know. And so that money will lay there in perpetuity. What we've got to do is look at a closer collaboration across the continent. So we start at home. They say charity begins at home. So we start in South Africa, but we definitely have to, we've got to penetrate the borders. We've got to work closer together as a continent, because the reality is that we've got migrant labor across the continent. And so these problems with unclaimed benefits will persist unless we look at a more, continental solution rather than just a solution in our country.
And I'm sure those kind of issues of working across, continent would augur very well with the Intercontinental Free Trade Agreement, and obviously which is one of the biggest, trade solutions for the continent. And therefore, for that to happen, we need to clean our house first and foremost, because we know when you're looking at South African setup from a governance point of view, the malfeasance that is happening, in municipalities, malfeasance that is happening in the private security setup. So sure, by the time we get to a point where we're talking across border or auto enrollment, so the basics around having proper structures, having proper men and women who are appointed on merit to oversee the administration of the funds and reporting from time to time, and not just only tick boxes, but having some kind of a triangulation of the data across key partners, FSA, SARS, government, and regulator. So these are very important pillars that will enable some of the issues that you as a sector have identified, and that can be addressed in a short term, medium, and to a long term.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we speak governance, and for me, a very big part of governance is enabling. We were having a discussion the other day, and we were saying, you give a member that has earned 10,000 Rand a month, R1 million at retirement, and you expect him to know what to do with it, how to act with R1 million. The member is sitting at the pub and somebody says, tenders are taking off, there's a trucking, there's a logistics tender or whatever. The member throws half of that money, if not more than that, at this thing, and it fails. And then you've got a member that, is now half of his or 75% of his retirement benefit is gone, and he's coming back to the state, because how does he survive going forward? Now, we've got to educate, we've got to enable, we've got to provide tools. And so I think technology, what SALT has focused on, is putting that accessibility in the member's hand. We've gamified education in our platforms so that we have members. I mentioned the private security sector that we administer. We also administer the transport sector retirement fund, and that's truckers. So they are up at all hours of the night. And what we've seen is that members will go into our platform and play with the different scenarios. And what we hope that does is educate them in terms of, if I keep withdrawing my two-pot, I'm going to be, down 50% at retirement. So maybe that's not such a great idea. So we put that in the platform so that they've got exposure to it. But we talk about members and their education. Trustees are more important, if not as important as members. You're asking somebody from a labor union or an employer organization who sometimes only have a matric certificate. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but what we've got to do is equip them. Now you bring that person onto a board of trustees and you ask them to manage 16 billion Rand in assets. And you haven't given him the tools. You haven't given him the tools to know, is this a good investment? Is the governance in order? What should I be asking when they tell me that this is the policy that they're introducing? What happens in procurement? Because the guy says he'll give me 500,000. Does that make sense? Is that what I should be doing? So those are the things that we've got to sort. Good governance, it builds confidence. It protects members. It enables innovation. It strengthens sustainability. But to get there, we've got to teach our trustees. We've got to teach our members what's right and what's wrong and what's required.
I couldn't agree with you more. These are very, very useful points that you put to us around, first and foremost, we've picked up that there's, billions of rands of unclaimed benefits, particularly from the migrant worker. Obviously, that money is still sitting idle, and yet those beneficiaries don't even know that it exists. So therein lies in a bigger problem, because that can unlock a whole lot of other challenges that we're seeing. You also put into us the importance of and creating from a governance point of view, creating enabling environment or that position education to the fore for that for members, so that they know if they catch their money, what is the best way to invest and how to invest. And I think you also hit it on a nail by giving a sense that the trustees, because if you are overseeing billions of rands, surely the level of qualification, the level of sophistication, so to speak, because it's not only about qualification, but sophistication on the importance of data, first and foremost, being able to unpack the data and read the data so that you're able to put what is in the best interest of the beneficiaries or the members based on how you articulate. So those are very important points that you put into us. So I would imagine, your entity is obviously pushing, you're not only just identifying challenges, but also putting forward solutions, such as gamification, as a tool, so that you're able to educate not only your members, but also trustees. What else can be done to strengthen the kind of interventions that your sector is putting forward in closing these gaps?
Absolutely. So I think for us, technology is a massive advantage, an absolutely massive advantage, right? So we obviously are at the advent of artificial intelligence, and I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface there. But data-driven insights can help the trustees to process the large sets of data that they get from their service provider and help them to make better decisions. Automation is going to take away the grunt work, the day-to-day clicking of a button, etc. But that capacity shouldn't be lost. It should be transferred into the human element, into innovation, into spending more time helping the member understand what decisions they should be making, into helping the trustee understand what the impact is of their decision. So technology for us is one of the biggest things that we're looking at in terms of fostering in solutions. So digital onboarding of employers, self-service portals. We were one of the few administrators that were able to navigate the two-part reform successfully. We didn't have any downtime when our systems came up for two-part. We were able to successfully pay claims. And I'll give you an example here. Prior to two-part, for a normal withdrawal claim, it took us 6 to 8 weeks to settle the claim. You wait for contributions to come in. It takes time. You wait for the tax directive to come back from SARS. So there's a whole process we go through. So we then processed 6,000 claims a month at that point in time. With two-part, we process in excess of 6,000 claims in a week, a day sometimes. So our average turnaround time for a claim has reduced from 8 weeks, so 2 months, to a week. Sometimes we pay them in a day or two. So technology is definitely a tool to help us. What we've done then is refocus our energy on which members are repeat customers. Why do they keep coming back to claim their two-part money? Do they understand the impact at retirement? When we went live with our online, our self-service portal, it was just before COVID. And even the funds we administer were doubtful. They were like, you know what's going to happen is if you don't do your work, because we're an administrator. So what we do is we receive the contributions and we allocate it to the member record. They said, if you don't do your work, the member's going to see. You're going to cause trouble for yourself. But we were happy to be held accountable for either doing or not doing our work. And that's still the case. We're not perfect as an administrator, but we are an administrator that tries to be better every single day. So data analytics, technology solutions, so that takes away the day-to-day mundane work and we can focus on ensuring that we educate our members, that we customize our service, that we talking to that a member doesn't just feel like a member or a number in a queue, that they understand that we know what their situation is. So stuff like online beneficiary nomination forms, prompting them when we see there's a change, engaging them when we see they keep withdrawing from their two-pot, those things, to personalize those things so that the member understands that this is not something that he pays every month and we forget about him until he comes back to claim at either a job change or at retirement. This is a journey we're living with him every single day.
On that beautiful note, we're going to take another break. When you come back, we will gravitate towards the end of this beautiful conversation, which I certainly hope it's enriching the understanding of our listeners. And once again, if you've got any views, our SMS line is 061-895-1095. And of course, your views and thoughts are most welcome via my X handle, which is _Dr. Mele. After the break, we'll continue this beautiful conversation with Nazlie Seegers, who is the Chief Experience Officer at SALT Employee Benefit.
This is Beyond Governance with Dr. Nimrod Dembele on 101.9 High FM.
Welcome back. This is Nimrod Dembele at the host of Beyond Governance at 101.9 High FM, and having fascinating and thought-provoking and illuminating conversation with Nazlie Seegers, who is the Chief Experience Officer at SALT Employee Benefits. The gist of our conversation really is unpacking the retirement industry. So, a SALT Employee Benefit is one of those organizations that comes across as an advocate around the benefits of employees. I mean, before you took that break, we got to hear a little bit more on how SALT Employee Benefits is really advancing the cause of employees. We heard about issues around how technology has been used and to fast track disbursement, how data solution that have been used to customize services. So there has been obviously a huge appetite in using and embracing technology to actually better administration of funds. One of the issues, Nazlie, perhaps maybe this is obviously the bigger issue than SALT Employee Benefits as an institution. I've picked up that South Africa continues, as you might know, to face one of the highest unemployment rates in South Africa. We know our official unemployment rate, we're sitting at north of 30%. But when you look at when you're using a broader definition of unemployment rate, we way of 40% or so, and it's even getting worse when you're talking about the youth. In that context, obviously, this invariably addresses the low retirement savings, primarily, and also, a behavioral issue. So beyond just, administering the funds that you have, how are you supporting the system to increase, or perhaps maybe for those that are working, increase the knowledge on the importance of savings, and bearing in mind that everyone else is obviously being pressured. I mean, we're experiencing rising food costs, transport costs, electricity, and now the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East, it's another dimension. So that creates a further pressure. How is the industry, educating and navigating and finding creative solutions such that the fiscus does not dwindle, because more and more people seem to be out of work? Because earlier on, we spoke about artificial intelligence. At one level, it's good insofar as enhancing administration, but on the other hand, for those that are not jumping into the bandwagon and using it to better themselves, most of the jobs are going to be obsolete, which further undermines or create further burden for members who would obviously be out of the system, and creating a burden for the state. So the question really is what is that the sector is doing, bearing in mind of those particular issues, even though issues about employment are sitting outside the core function of administrators.
Agreed, it does sit probably outside of the core function of administrators. But I think as an industry, and the BATSITA conference that happened in June of 2026, as well as the conference that we attended in Mauritius earlier this year, the discussion on the continent at this point in time, so I talk about the continent because, like I said, we've spoken to a number of countries as SALT employee benefits about sort of the retirement ecosystem on the African continent. And one of the things that we're discussing as a continent is investment. So I think we touched on it earlier, but we're sending money, we're pushing money into overseas markets. We want dollar-based accounts. We want euro-based accounts. It makes no sense for us as a continent. Our power is at home. And so what we should be doing is recalling capital that we've sent into first world countries. We need it back. We need to bring it back because there's infrastructure investments. If we invest in infrastructure in Africa, we create jobs. And so I think there's also this fallacy from the youth that, you've got to sit behind a desk and work on a laptop and that's how you are employed. But artisans are a critical part of growing, absolutely, building. And so we need to be starting at grassroots level. We need to be going into schools. And to that point, SALT has started an academy called Roots. Our first center was opened in Philippi in Cape Town, and we're looking at one in the Johannesburg region as well. And that takes kids after school in these areas, and it brings them into a center where we talk to them about, it doesn't mean that, you need to sit behind a desk in an office to be employed. There are other avenues in life, and we help them with homework and we do things like that. So that's at grassroots level. And then at the next level, we're having conversations and we're bringing interns into our business to help them, to give them exposure to the workplace, etc. And then we look at industry discussions and we say to our peers in the industry, bring the capital back, invest in infrastructure here. Our rail system should be one of the best. If our rail system was working, we would see so much efficiencies as a country. We would see so much job creation as a country. And so there's so many aspects that we can touch on. So I think for us, it doesn't mean that we're an administrator. We're not part of this conversation and we can't be part of the change. So I've told you about 3 of the things that we're doing to try and foster that change. The reality is you can't talk to somebody about saving when they don't have money for dinner tonight, when they don't have money to pay rent at the end of the month. It's an abstract concept for them. That's next year's problems or 10 years problems. Right now, they're hungry. There's no food in their belly. And so we've got to sort out unemployment. In terms of the members that are gainfully employed and are engaged in some sort of savings scheme, it doesn't always have to be that you start saving at 10% of your salary. What we try and do in our umbrella fund is we say to the employer, start at 5, start at 2.5, tell us where you can start, but start the behavior. In fact, in many instances, we'll say to the employer, start with the insurance so that if anything happens to the breadwinner of the family, there's at least a benefit so the kids can finish school so that they don't lose the roof over their head. So there's many ways to contribute. And I think that, we look at it as a holistic picture rather than just how do we get people to save more? It's how do we create an ecosystem that allows people to even think about saving in the first place?
I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to have a last quick break. When you come back, we'll wrap up this fascinating conversation, which I find illuminating in so many ways.
This is Beyond Governance with Dr. Nimrod Dembele on 101.9 High FM.
Welcome back. This is Beyond Governance. My name is Nimrod Dembele. I am joined by Nazlie Seegers, who's the Chief Experience Officer at SALT Employee Benefits. What a wonderful conversation that we've had thus far. We literally unpacking some of the challenges bedeviling the South Africa's retirement industry. It's also good to know that companies such as SALT Employee Benefits or funds such as Employee Benefits is really making good grounding in terms of addressing some of the issues that even sit outside their core business. But as we conclude, perhaps maybe one of the issues that from your end that you want to pose or maybe challenge the listeners with in the context of what you do, what would that be?
I think the biggest question is, do you know who your service provider is? Almost everybody has security. When I drive home in the afternoon, I drive through a boom gate. And at the boom gate, there's a security officer standing. And that security officer has a badge on his shirt. And very often, because I work for SALT employee benefits, I know whether or not the employer is compliant. When I go to the airport, I'll ask the guards, have you checked your Provident Fund lately? You know, the sad reality is that in many instances, the guards will say, ma'am, I know that they're not paying, but I need my salary, and so I can't fight the employer. But the people that award those contracts, hopefully your listeners who own businesses that employ security companies, that employ logistics companies, that employ cleaning companies, they can require their service providers to prove that they're not stealing from their workers, that they're not stealing from our members, that they are honoring their responsibilities in terms of paying across their contributions for the members where they are deducting. That would be my challenge.
No, thank you so much. I think that's that you made a very good point, and we're going to have to leave it just. Thank you so much for coming through, Nazlie.
Thank you so much for having us. We've really enjoyed being here.
Absolutely. That's a very fascinating conversation that you've just had with the one and only. I'm sure we're going to have to come back later because I don't think we've exhausted all issues, didn't we?
Absolutely not. We can talk for days.
There we go. That's Nazlie Seegers, who's the Chief Experience Officer at SALT Benefits. They're giving us very good insights of really what is happening. Once again, Nazlie, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and thoughts on this beautiful evening. Our discussions have reminded us that retirement is not simply a financial product. It is a governance issue that requires sound leadership, responsible stewardship, and informed decision-making. For many South Africans, the quality of life in retirement will depend on the choices they make today and the strength of the institution entrusted with protecting their services. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Governance. Until next time, remember that good governance is not only about institution, it's also about the decisions we make every day that shape our future. Good night and